Hello and welcome to another podcast on grieving in unprecedented times. My name is Ian Arthur. I'm the Salvation Army officer at Port Glasgow, and I'm joined today, as ever, by Gwyneth MacDonald from Mind Mosaic and Alison Bunce from Compassionate Inverclyde. And we're going to have a conversation just now around different aspects of grief. And as part of that kind of ongoing campaign, if you like, around Inverclyde this week, we're going to be having what we're calling the Sign of Strength campaign, which is organised by Inverclyde Community Action Response Group. Put my teeth back in. And there's going to be a whole host of billboards and posters around Inverclyde, just encouraging us all to ask for help when we need it, because it is actually a huge sign of strength to be able to put your hands up and have the bottle to say, actually, you know what, I need a hand here. We're community people, we're communal animals. We kind of need to be in community together and help each other together. Almost like, it takes a village to raise a child, but it takes a village to raise an adult as well. So this Thursday, hopefully this is going out on the right time, at the right day. This Thursday, there will be a light show up at Tower Hill with one of our posters from ICARG being plastered on there in glorious Technicolor. And every Thursday, the plan is that somewhere around Inverclyde, there will be a nice light show just to remind everyone to stand 6 feet together, and asking for help is a sign of strength. So that's the kind of little just there, just to keep your eye out, but also just to actually point out that it's a really serious thing to think about, that it is a real sign of strength. Today, we're going to be talking about the stages of grief. It's one of those, I was chatting with the guys beforehand, and it's one of those models that sometimes drives me a bit crazy, because there's 5 or 7, depending what model you look at. Today, we're looking at the one that's got 5 in, because it's a little bit easier. And there are 5 different stages of grief in kind of one of the famous models. They are denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And whilst it's not a linear thing or a kind of a cycle that you can move from one to the other in a kind of nice logical list, they are all kind of things that bubble up to the surface when we've lost someone or when we're grieving any sort of loss. So we're going to take it in turns and just talk about our own experience of loss, our own experience of grief, and kind of how these different stages have worked out for us. So without going on too much, so no one's sick of my voice, we'll start with denial, I think. And I'm going to hand over to Gwyneth and Alison. Have you guys been at a point of grief where you've kind of felt that you've been in a stage of denial?
Absolutely, Ian. Well said, great introduction. I can really relate to that. I lost both my parents in their 50s, both through having illnesses, cancer illnesses. So a long period of illness. And during that time, there was part of the preparation for loss, but also lots of denial, because throughout it, my father in particular, I'm thinking about it being Father's Day yesterday, so he's more in my mind at the moment, but he was very well. When he was diagnosed, we were told that he would die quite quickly. He had pancreatic cancer, which is quite a difficult type of cancer. We were told that he would die quite quickly, and he actually lived a year and was out and about, was very active during that time. So I think we were all in absolute denial at the time. And so therefore, when he did go downhill and die, it happened very quickly. And the shock around that was enormous, actually.
Yeah. One of the things, I don't know if avoidance is the same as denial, but one of the ways in which I coped with my dad when he was dying was that I wanted to avoid going so that I didn't have to experience the pain. Mm-hmm. So, and I've experienced that in other situations. So I wanted to distance myself before I actually got to the point of facing it.
Yeah.
I needed to do that, so it felt okay. But maybe to others that might have looked like I was running away or that I was just not facing up to it. But I needed that distance in order to bring myself to be able to get there and cope.
Yep, and I think it's important to recognise that there's no right or wrong, and there's no roadmap for how we grieve for someone, and everyone will manage and will cope in different ways, and that's okay. It's about cutting yourself a bit of slack and cutting others a bit of slack and allowing people to do what they need to do at that time.
Yeah, and that kind of that denial, if you like, some of it, I think avoidance would come under that. I think of myself, I mean, I lost my dad 5 years ago. He died sudden heart attack the week before he was due to come up and see us in our first couple of weeks in Scotland, or couple of months in Scotland. And actually, the way I got through that was I went into officer mode. I went into minister mode. My boss phoned me and said, we'll get a minister to the hospital for you at the Salvation Army office so that there's someone to minister to you and the family. And I said, no, I'm going. That's my job. That was the role that I stepped into to get me through that stage. When I did my dad's funeral, it was because that's the only way I was going to get through it. And I think there is something in that denial that covers distraction, that covers actually saying, look, I don't want to face that now until I'm ready to face it, which is a healthy thing. I mean, there's also the fact that it can go down the line of being a little bit unhealthy and having that kind of extreme of kind of just completely outright denying that something's happened and trying to live as if everyone's still there and nothing's ever happened and burying it down. But I think actually in its purest form, it can be really helpful.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Ian, my father was young, so consequently we were all quite young, and I had two younger sisters who were still teenagers. I'm the eldest of the family, and we are a family of four. And so I stepped right into organising and supporting all of them, and just making sure that everyone else was fine and, everything was sorted for the funeral and all of that, which of course very, very neatly keeps you out of your own stuff at that time. But again, that's okay. That's what I needed to do at that time. I couldn't have done both.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that. So with having got the denial out of the way, we move swiftly on to our next joyous stage of grief, and that is anger. And the little diagram I've got in front of me says frustration, irritation, and anxiety are all kind of wrapped up in that anger stage. So how have we felt anger in that stage of grief?
Yep. I felt a huge anger once I had got past the kind of arrangements and organisation. I felt cheated because he was 57, and I was thinking that's no age at all, for anyone to die. And, he had grandchildren that were very, very young. My children at the time were 5 and 6, I think. And my sister was pregnant. So there was a lot of anger around what he had missed, and that it felt unjust that it shouldn't have happened.
Yeah, I didn't feel anger on my dad's death, but if I think back to when I first experienced somebody really close was when I was 16, and it was my granddad. And I remember going back, it was my first funeral that I had ever attended, and I went back to the cooperative halls at the time, and I couldn't go over that everybody was normal and sharing stories and talking about him as if he was still here. And I felt a huge amount of anger about, I've lost somebody who's so important to me. Does nobody see that? And does nobody recognise how sad that I am? But it wasn't until a long number of years later that I recognised that those sharing stories at a funeral was so important. But that, it made me angry as a young adult.
Absolutely, yes. And there is something in that about the recognition that different people will feel a range of emotions, and there may, for some people, depending on the relationship they have with someone, be a sense of relief, or not be as big a sense of loss as someone else might feel. And it's the acceptance of all of that whole, continuum of emotions across the spectrum.
Yeah.
And it is the kind of, it's that knock-on effect that because we all grieve differently as well, often you can end up being angry at someone else's grieving when they're just trying to express what they need to express, whether that's telling stories with a smile when everything in you wants to scream, or whether it's sat in a corner in a puddle when everyone else is saying, "Oh, come on, we need to talk through this and get that." Because there is no linear way that people grieve, because there's no kind of official model that people will always go through, and because we all get those waves of grief hitting at different times in different ways, it can almost kind of escalate things in your own mind until you understand that actually that's how they're grieving and that's how they're grieving, and that we all do it different. I think in terms of anger, certainly when I lost my grandparents, it wasn't too much of an anger. Just thinking back to kind of the first funerals I would have gone to as a kid, there was sadness, but not really anger in my mind. I think because they were grandparents, they were kind of, when you're 10, 12 years old, someone in their 50s is old, someone in their 60s is doing really well. And many of my family don't tend to get much past 60. So, but certainly with my dad, I did feel the anger, but I couldn't tell you who it was for. I couldn't tell you who it was aimed at. It wasn't aimed at God. It wasn't aimed at my dad. It wasn't aimed at anyone else around me. It was just an absolute shivering, fearful anger that you just can't pinpoint. And I think that's the other thing. A lot of people think, well, you have this anger and you don't know where to jump it or what to do. And that's why I ended up, I started journaling fairly early on after my dad died. But, there is that thing of actually listing down that anger and acknowledging that it's there is a really important thing. Because I think often we can say, well, actually, that's not a good thing. I don't want anyone to hear that. I don't want anyone to say that or whatever else. I know I've said to a few people over the last couple of weeks as I've been doing funerals and visiting bereaved families, actually, from a Christian minister's point of view, God is big enough to take anything you can shout at him, anything you can swear at him, anything you can go off at one, because actually we need to get that emotion out, and it's okay to be angry. In fact, it's better to be angry than it is to kind of dig it down deep somewhere and just mull on and try and be all stoic about it. Yes.
That's so important, Ian, isn't it? Because anger is often the emotion that feels less acceptable to people than the other emotions of being upset or crying or the distress. The anger often is more frightening to people, or...
Yeah, I guess people expect you to be sad and depressed and, feeling overwhelmed. They expect you to kind of be struggling to work out how that works. And whilst everyone expects you to be angry, we don't want to show ourselves as being angry, or as, I think there's a lot of society and culture is that as individuals, we feel that everyone else will think worse of us if we do what's right. And everyone else thinks that we'll think worse of them if we see them doing it. But actually, we all just need to get this stuff out and actually deal with it in the open. And I guess that's kind of where we're going with the whole sign of strength stuff, is that actually, yeah, it's okay to be angry as well as everything else.
It's okay. Yeah, that's a good way to see it. It's okay.
Yeah. So our next stage that we've got, and I appreciate we're kind of rattling through them, but it's down to the time that we've got, is depression. And underneath the heading of depression on my little model here, I've got words like overwhelmed, helplessness, hostility, and fight. And I guess that's kind of, some of those are grey areas with the anger, but there'll always be kind of overlaps throughout. But how have we felt depression in grief, do you think?
For me, it was often about forgetting. So I would waken up in the morning and forget that my dad was no longer with us. And then you have that wave of almost like a heaviness or something that comes over you when you do remember.
Yep, I experienced that as well. Getting to sleep was almost like a relief
Hmm.
because you weren't in the real time.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Mm.
I think overwhelming sadness is what I felt, but not depression.
No, no, I think I probably perhaps have a different view of depression, or a more extreme view of depression, because working as a therapist, you see a lot of people who really, really struggle.
Mm.
So yeah, for me, I would agree it was the overwhelming sadness, the flatness, the kind of what's the point type of feeling at times. Um, yeah, and difficult, and it seemed to come in waves. I had young children at the time, and children are great levelers, aren't they? And they have a great way of bringing you out of things, and they demand attention regardless of what else is going on. So there were times when I managed okay and managed to almost put it to the side, and other times where it just engulfed me.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I guess the fact that it's the word depression can be quite a scary one, can't it?
Yeah.
Because obviously the model was put together before perhaps depression was seen as purely the clinical depression rather than the actual definition of feeling deflated, of being um, saddened, but not necessarily to that clinical level. I mean, I would say actually, I went through both of those quite happily, and I'm still going through some of it now.
Yeah.
I would wake up. I mean, my dad actually had his own battles with his mental health, and had been retired from. He was retired from his 30s, late 30s. By the time he got to 40, he had a heart attack and a stroke. So he wasn't the most healthy guy. But after he died, I found myself waking up, shivering, crying, unconsolable, wreck. And then that just started the whole spiral of I'm turning into my dad. I'm going to go down that way as well. And what does this mean? Um, and 5 years later, I can turn around and say, right, I'm tired now. I need to rest because otherwise I'm going to get in that state. But at the time, it was as you said, those waves hit. But when they hit me, they absolutely knocked me for six. And I went from being kind of the jolly, jokey optimist to being, you know, some days borderline suicidal and wondering what the hell to do.
It sounds like at times, Ian, that there was a lot of fear attached to that, and fear around.
There was. There was a lot of fear of the unknown, a lot of fear of actually having seen my dad's struggles. Am I going to go down the same thing?
Yeah.
You know, he was the eldest son. I'm the eldest son. Did all that stuff. Thankfully, through the Salvation Army, I can phone our wellbeing unit up and they can sort me out a counsellor within 2 weeks. So actually, I got to that point and talked to my wife, who is, you know, she's a qualified nurse. She knows what she's talking about, and she said you probably need to chat to someone here.
Yeah.
And being a bloke, that probably took more time to convince me than it should have. But having now, I think my third round of counsellor with a different counsellor, actually, it has been phenomenal. The fact that the different levels I've gone through have then helped not so much bring me out of that depression, but actually be able to reframe a lot of the stuff that I'm doing and look after my own mental health. So actually, whilst it was a horrific thing to go through at the time, and not all of it was kicked off by grief, actually, what it's shown is it's made me a lot more self-aware and a lot more able to ask for help and to see that as a strength. Um, you know, my dad would never take help. He'd never accept help. He'd never ask for help. He ended up a mess. Actually, there's a lesson to be learned there. Yeah.
So you really noticed the parallel processes there, Ian, and stepped in to do it differently, and
Yeah,
took that as a sign of strength, that you're asking for help was your sign of strength. Yeah.
definitely. And I think there is a lot of that kind of holding your hand up and saying, actually, yeah, I'm struggling with this. I need a hand, because if you were drowning in a swimming pool, you wouldn't tell the lifeguard, "No, it's all right. Give me a minute. I'll be fine." Um, I mean, in your head as a bloke, you probably would. But you're not going to do that. You're going to stick your head and shout for help. That's what you do. And I think often when we're not so well emotionally or mentally, we don't think we can for some reason, which is an odd thing. Um,
Yeah, that's a very good analogy. Actually, it's very true, Ian. Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So yeah, the depression, I think, you know, it hits us all differently. Some of us get the full-on clinical side. Some of us get that overwhelming sadness. The waves, I think, is something that I always hear people talking about it. Whoever I've spoken to who's gone through that period of grief, I think we've all been through a period of grief, whether it's because we've had someone close to us die, or because we've lost a way of living, or, you know, because we've lost the ability to go out and be normal or whatever else. But I think everyone that I've spoken to that has grieved has used the word waves and
Yeah.
said that it hits you unexpectedly. And I think that's the depression point, is probably the one that is that wave, isn't it? It's that suddenly you're overwhelmed by that sadness, or that fact that someone's not there. And it never happens when you want it to happen. It only ever happens when you're least expecting it, which is all
The-
normal.
From a
Yeah.
therapeutic point of view, we often store emotions in our body rather than cognitively in our brain. So it's often things like smells or music, sounds, olfactory sounds that will bring memories back to us, and that's what takes us unaware. So somebody might catch a smell of an aftershave that their dad wore, or a perfume that their mum wore, and that might be enough to take them back into their grief. Hearing a song in the radio was my thing. My dad loved music, so hearing one of his favourite songs in the radio was enough to reduce me to tears for a long time afterwards. And I think that's often the thing that takes us unaware. It's our somatic responses, or our body responses, you know, that kick in before our brain manages to kick in.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that actually, oddly, when you do start asking for help, and particularly on that point of your body holding it, that's when you suddenly realise quite how much you've been carrying, and how much you're physically holding it in your body. And you know, I don't think it's a coincidence that when you look at kind of the Eastern medicines and all that sort of stuff that they talk about, you know, whether it's a chi or whatever, of needing to be relaxed before you can be well, and that kind of somatic idea that actually, you know, if I'm feeling really, really tense, it's not necessarily because I've done something the day before. It's because actually my emotions are doing something and my body's then manifesting that.
I, yeah. I had a head and heart thing.
Right?
So if I functioned in my head, then I was in my own mind being, you know, strong and able to cope, and everything was okay. But as soon as I felt as if I was in my heart and I allowed myself to feel emotion, then there was a, you know, like that was when there was an outpouring of whatever emotion it would be, whether I would really be crying or sobbing, or you know, whatever I was feeling. But I had this ability to separate my head and heart,
Yeah.
and it became I became quite skilled at it. And then
Interesting.
I suppose in a way I'm like that now.
Yes.
Um,
And often that's the way we cope, don't we? We compartmentalise things. We put things in boxes and put them to the side and bring it out when we've got time to look at it. And that's okay as well, isn't it?
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it's one of those interesting ones because it's a great way to cope and to get through it. And if it's used well and healthy, and you go back to that box and deal
Yeah.
with the stuff, you're in a good place, in a good space to deal with that.
Yeah.
If it all spills out, it's brilliant. Equally, as long as it's about making sure that you do go back to it rather than just leaving it to one side until it all festers and bubbles up. I mean, I know from a church point of view, we went. You know, you always get this kind of Hellenistic Greek thing of, you know, there's the body and there's the spirit, and one's good and one's evil, and it's like, well, no, actually, this is all kind of mushed up together, and we need to work out how body, soul, and spirit all work together, and all that side of things. But yeah, I think that kind of compartmentalizing is a really useful thing. I mean, it always reminds me of the TED talk where a guy goes through how men's brains and women's brains work, and he shows you all these different boxes and says, men's brain, you've got all these boxes, and this box is called the nothing box, and that's where we go to. And then he brings out theoretically, from a woman's brain, everything's interconnected. And how does that work on boxers? But yeah, we all kind of work differently and box things differently. But I think it is a good skill to have if you know in your head, as Alison put it, where you are and what's going on, and then you can kind of plug into the other stuff when you're in a good place to offload.
Go back to it. Yeah. Often people's way of managing, and people's way of getting through their day and their work and their life. But yeah, you're right, Ian. It's about being able to go back and access and look at that, walk through that.
And it's the thing that stops you going down in an ever descending spiral of depression, isn't it? It's because you're not just thinking about that one thing. You're able to distract yourself or to be able to function in your day to day and then come back to that.
Diversionary, yeah, absolutely.
I'm aware we took probably more time over depression than the other two, but I think that's important because I think that's probably the one where, it is probably the one where, whilst anger is something we don't want people to see, depression can be a really scary word and can almost feel like a bit of a taboo in terms of you don't want to use the word depression because of all the stuff that goes behind it. But those overwhelming waves of sadness, of kind of deflation, I think are really important to recognise as being quite a big part of grief and bereavement.
Yeah, it's often the one where people feel overwhelmed.
I think if you can take the edge off that one, you can almost deal with the others a little bit more easily.
Yeah.
So our next stage, just kind of moving us through, is bargaining. We've got that struggling to find meaning, reaching out to others, and telling your own story. So there's that kind of bargaining mentality. Anyone felt that one in grief?
I think probably I felt it during my parents' illness. And I think that's because you probably, when somebody is given a life-limiting diagnosis, you start the process at that time, and bargaining is often a part of it then. And for me, they're interchangeable. They don't come in a linear process. So bargaining often comes before depression. If I'll go to church every Sunday, if only he's cured, I will do this if only, he gets better, that kind of thing. I can certainly relate to that.
Yeah, I was exactly the same, Gwyneth. It was during probably my dad's illness more that, like if only. And do you know what? There was a time that I wished it was me, so that my dad didn't have to experience what he was going through. So I was if only quite a lot for a lot of things.
Yeah, I think I would be more on the. I mean, I'm all. If our family had a motto, a friend of mine used to say that expect to see it written on my gravestone. It would be right. That's the kind of Yorkshireman's mantra. It'll be right. Whatever happens, it'll be right. And that kind of there's a point to which that is hoping for the best or deciding that it'll all come out in the wash and we'll all be fine in the end. And there's a point to where it's just a kind of a blind, optimistic whitewash of it'll be right. Yeah, but it won't be. Yeah, it'll be fine. And just we don't think about it and it'll be fine. And I think that kind of comes more under the denial.
Yes.
But I think when thinking about my dad particularly, I think there's a lot of bargaining. I would agree actually that the bargaining and the if onlys often come for me just before. I think back to when I was a kid and I was probably about 13, maybe 14 when my granddad died, or one of my granddads died. I was kind of 11 when one died and the other one went 4 or 5 years later. And actually, I can remember now me being stood at the bottom of my stairs or sat at the bottom of the stairs with no one else there praying, look, God, he needs to get through this. He needs to get through this. Like, what do we need? If I pray enough, he'll get through this. The years have taught me now that I just pray, Lord, I don't want him to suffer. Whatever you need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in itself is that moving on from that kind of bargaining side of things. But I think there is still that it's a combination between the if onlys and what can I do? What can we do? You know, if we're there talking all the time, if I whisper something into his ear when he's on a ventilator saying, you know, don't you flipping well go away before I come back. Will that, you know, he'll listen and he'll just come through because that's what he needs to do just now. And it's almost, yeah, it is that kind of, well, as long as this goes up, and this goes up, and this goes up, we're all good. And, you know, you see one number go up on a machine and you're like, that's it, we're getting there. So, yeah, I would say that I've often, when I've gone through that, it has been just before, and whether that's been kind of knowing deep down what's going to happen.
Yes.
Desperately want something else. And actually needing to kind of put that out there and put that into some sort of logical kind of verbalization. I don't know. I think it is kind of one of those necessary things that I think we all have to go through of, well, you know, what if I do, because at the end of the day, if we go through that, we then realize that actually there's nothing we could have done.
No.
There's nothing we could have done different that would have made any least bit of difference. You know, you're not the doctor looking after them. You're not, you know, you're not them that's done whatever to themselves over their life, or you know, you have no control over a random one-off heart attack that's just one of those things, or whatever circumstances have gone into that loss. There's not been any control. Actually, the bargaining helps us to maybe address some of the fact that we have no control in the situation, which I think is where my denial head went when I said, no, I need to be the officer here. I need to be the minister because then I am in control of this part. And when you said about being the oldest sibling looking after the funeral, it is that thing of, you know, I can control this bit. But actually the bargaining it's almost the start of that. And I would agree, when I've experienced that, it's actually come before the person's physically died, but when you're kind of preparing yourself, I think.
It's about processing it yourself, and that is heading towards acceptance, isn't it? That's about you trying to process it yourself, what is actually happening and what has happened, which is kind of edging you towards the acceptance of it.
Yeah.
And the acceptance is interesting for me. I often hear from people whom we are supporting at Mind Mosaic that I can't accept this because then I'll be letting them go, and I don't want to let her go or him go. And
yeah.
It's about that, unpicking that a bit, you know, accepting it within yourself is not about you feeling any less close to the person.
Yeah. I think that's the thing. I mean, acceptance is kind of the last one of the five that we haven't touched yet. And it is, I mean, the words I've got on the model are exploring options, new plans in place, and moving on. And it is that kind of drawing a line and starting a new chapter and finding that new normal. It's probably, I think those that have worked with people who have lost folk who are grieving, who are probably now sick of the fact that new normal has become a new normal phrase. Because certainly that's how I would always have described, you know, things won't be the same. There will be a new normal, and it's about kind of having the closure in a positive way. And I think that's why, you know, if you're at a funeral, particularly a cremation, and as soon, you know, I know full well, and I will prepare people when I'm doing a funeral weeks or days beforehand, as long as I've got. So look, when that button gets pressed, you may well find that when the curtains close, that's when everything hits you like a ton of bricks, because that's kind of when the denial is acted to some extent, and the acceptance will kick in, possibly if you like it or not. And that I guess is where that comes in. I mean, I don't know how you guys have dealt with kind of acceptance in your own grieving, and whether you've found any kind of helpful ways to do that.
I often say to people, it's not about letting go, because there's this phrase that people will often say, you need to let go, and that's what people seem to fear. And it's not about letting to go. It doesn't mean it will get easier or get less painful, or it'll just be different. You know, you manage it differently.
Yeah, I think I experienced acceptance in quite a big way, in that I knew and I know that my dad is dead, physically dead, but I actually feel much closer to him now, because it's just changed my relationship with him. So I can't physically see him, but the love that I have in my heart still grows. And that's an acceptance thing for me. And it's a real comfort as well. And the other acceptance thing is that when you can actually talk about the person that's died without being in floods of tears or whatever, that kind of.
Nice. And I loved what you said there, Alison, about holding him in your heart, because that kind of is essentially what I was saying. It's about not letting go. It's about, you know, holding them in a different way, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is interesting how that kind of permeates through different cultures, because, you know, there's a reason why we have absent friends toasts at weddings. There's a reason, you know, why, you know, in many traditions where they hold the ancestors up, if someone's pouring a drink, the first shot gets poured on the floor for the ancestors and for the people that have gone before, because, you know, that relationship is still there, but it's changed. And, you know, I'm sure there's other cultural and religious traditions that have grown up around that, actually, you know, we celebrate and we kind of change that relationship. I mean, the Salvation Army, we've got a phrase that always raises a smile, that when someone is to glory, because it's the idea that actually there's been a change in that relationship. They've had a promotion that gets celebrated. We grieve because we've lost them, but actually it's not it's not an ending.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of hope, and obviously coming from a Christian tradition, we have that kind of eternal hope, which I think does help with that, and helps with that idea of, you know, ongoing relationship and how that works out. Actually, you can kind of hold that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's really comforting to think the relationship with the dead person hasn't stopped; it has just changed.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah,
absolutely. I often quote, there's a Christian teacher, theologian called Tom Wright, and he writes some really, really deep stuff that is, you know, way above my pay grade, and, you know, you need a dictionary to be able to read it. But he also writes some really down-to-earth stuff that actually makes just a lot of sense. And he wrote one book, which is actually about hope. And he wrote about his own dad's funeral, and he said that because of the way he understood the resurrection and eternal life and heaven and hell and all that sort of stuff, to him, when his dad died, it wasn't a goodbye, it was good night and I'll see you in the morning.
Yeah.
It was the idea that actually, you know, I'm not saying this is the end, I'm saying actually we're moving into a new creation, if you like, a
new realm of you.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that does help with the acceptance. I guess having any sort of belief, even if it's a belief that that's just it and you're finished, it will potentially help that acceptance. I think, you know, I always wonder how people get through bereavement without a faith, if I'm honest, because I'm not sure if I could. But at the same time, there are many ways we can get to that level of acceptance, I guess. And that's, I guess, whilst there's no linear model of these, that's the one where we should kind of finish off in the end.
Absolutely, yeah. And everyone will have something different to believe in that's important to them. Is that a good place for us to finish, guys?
Just about to suggest similar.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was interesting. Okay.
When you get the three of us chatting, we just go on and on and on and on.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Lots to chat about. So I hope everyone enjoys this podcast. It's a bit longer than our other ones, but I hope it's been interesting for people. And please remember the Sign of Strength campaign, which is launched this week. in Inverclyde, and have a wee look out for it. Okay, and I will speak to you two later.
Grand.
Okay, thank you. Bye bye.